salt, then you taste it.
Hello, friends. This is episode 3 of the David O. Stewart Show, season 1, The Democracy We Must Keep. This month, we interview George Goodwin, author of The Propaganda Wars of the American Revolution. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, proud producer of the show on Incandescent Radio, Incandescent TV, and you can also find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. So, David, I'm going to throw it over to you. George has such an amazing background. He's an Englishman himself, and he will give us insight into a fellow British author and a renegade who, in 1776, wrote Common Sense, Thomas Paine. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Hope. And it's a delight to have George here. We were unintended housemates for a short time at Mount Vernon, and I think we managed to remain friends the whole time. And George has promised to express no bitterness about the outcome of the American Revolutionary Wars. And in fact, I believe his attitude is that Britain is well rid of us. But he has studied to a wonderful degree the nature of propaganda during the revolution. And of course, one of our leading voices was Thomas Paine, ironically enough, an Englishman, or perhaps maybe described as a renegade Englishman. George, can you give us some quick background on Paine's experience in England? He's lived there until he was almost 40.
Well, of course. I mean, I will kick off by saying that I am English, but I am also a historian, most importantly. And I could also argue that George Washington, for 2/3 of his life, was British. Not quite so much as Thomas Paine, for 5/7 of his life was British. So I think I'm in extremely good company. But on to the renegade Thomas Paine. He was born in 1737 in Thetford. It's a Norfolk town of between 1,500 to 2,000 people. Now, interestingly, his father was a tenant farmer, but also a staymaker, i.e. he made corsets. And his mother was an Anglican whose father was an attorney, the town clerk, and an excise man. So it was quite an interesting mix. And Thomas Paine was all of these things, and he was also a lot of other things. He was a very clever chap. He was grammar school educated for a short time, but he was obviously extremely bright. He did some teaching. Oh, he was a pirate for a time, which is always an interesting one to have on your CV. And he worked for the excise, and he was sacked and reinstated a couple of times.
Excise means he was a taxman, right?
Absolutely. He collected the kind of the internal customs on goods internally in the country. And as an excise man, he was a bit of a trade union figure, if you like, because the customs officers were badly paid, their conditions were very poor, and this led to Paine writing his first political pamphlet, which was the case of officers of excise, in which he put their position. Now, he actually got sacked from that job, and various other things didn't work very well. He had all kinds of businesses. He had a shop that didn't do very well, and various other sort of enterprises. So this actually was a pattern through his life. Very, very often, things didn't go right, but he always bounced back. Now, he was also impressive in that a commissioner of excise, i.e. his big boss, George Lewis Scott, rather took to him, even though, he was a bit dodgy with the books. And Lewis was interested in mathematics and scientific things, and he introduced him to one Benjamin Franklin, who spent the best part of 2 decades, including in this period, the early 1770s, in London. And Benjamin Franklin gave a very important letter of introduction to Thomas Paine, which allowed Thomas Paine to go to America and to possibly, to sort of settle in with Franklin's own son-in-law. And I have the very, very letter here, which is, or rather, a copy of the letter, not the original, obviously, in which Franklin writes to his son-in-law and says, "The bearer, Mr. Thomas Paine, is very well recommended to me as an ingenious, worthy young man. He goes to Pennsylvania with a view of settling there. I request you to give him your best advice and countenance, as he is quite a stranger there. If you can put him in a way of obtaining employment as a clerk or assistant tutor in a school," he had actually done a bit of teaching, Paine at one stage, "or assistant surveyor, of all of which I think him very capable, so that he may procure a subsistence at least, till he can make acquaintance and obtain a knowledge of the country. You will do well, and much oblige your affectionate father." So Paine went over, he arrived, the letter was dated the 30th of September, and Paine arrived in Philadelphia on the 30th of November. And it was a fairly sort of standard thing with Paine. He always was very, very ill at the wrong moment. So he was suffering from diphtheria on the voyage, and he arrived on a stretcher, in very bad shape indeed. But he was looked after by Franklin's son-in-law, and they started to look for pupils for Paine. But what Paine did was he made a friend of the local bookseller, a chap called Robert Atkin, who installed him as editor of a new publication that he had in mind, called the Pennsylvania Magazine. And Paine started writing away, and very happily for 18 months or so. And he made some good friends, one of whom was Benjamin Rush, who was attracted to an article on slavery, or the abolition of slavery from Paine's perspective, and they got chatting. And Rush said, "Oh, why don't you do some writings on criticizing British colonial policy?" And that set Paine off on writing.
And the piece that drew me to Paine, of course, was that first major publication, which was Common Sense, a rather brief pamphlet by today's standards, at least. It's just 13,000 words, but it proved to be electrifying to the American public, and it was the bestseller in America, with sold over 150,000 copies. And became a major influence over the argument going on between the British and the Americans.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, basically, it turned out to be an incredibly important pamphlet on British imperial policy. I mean, it was sharpened by the arrival in America in November of a royal proclamation from Britain by the King declaring the colonies to be in rebellion. And that was quite important, because that actually did change and strengthen Paine's argument. But within the proclamation, it has some crucial words.
George, forgive me, if you can give sort of a capsule description of his message.
I certainly can. The message was, and I'm going to give it to you in Paine's own words. It was destruction of the power of monarchy, which he thought was incredibly important, because he believed that the Americans had a regard for monarchy and the monarch as a protector of them against the appalling treatment of the British ministries. So what he did was he took the approach of, first of all, saying, well, what is society for? And I'm going to go straight into Paine. And he said, society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. It almost sounds a bit like Ronald Reagan, this. In its worst state, it's an intolerable one. For when we suffer or exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without government, our calamities are heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. So then he went on and described what's the purpose of government? The design and end of government is freedom and security. So what is, what's the purpose? Who is the king? In America, the law is king. For as in absolute governments, the king is law. So in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. Then he turned on Britain. But the crown, as this overbearing part in the English constitution, needs to be mentioned, and it derives its whole consequence merely from being the giver of places and pensions, i.e., the king holds the key to absolute power, and then basically puts the boot into George III.
Well, when he says the law is king, that was not the case in most of the world at that time. So he was
absolutely. I mean,
pronouncing a pretty revolutionary doctrine.
Completely and utterly. And basically, he was actually sort of moving the whole argument. And he went further. I mean, he really did go so far as to attack the very idea of hereditary monarchy on two levels. Basically, he thought that it's ridiculous to kowtow to monarchs who, if you go back into their history, are descended to the biggest, nastiest, toughest ruffian who established the monarchy in the first place. And then on the other hand, he says it's unworthy of deference because, quite frankly, picking people to rule by an accident of birth is ludicrous, because you get some really bad ones, and you also get some bad ones who are also totally useless. So, I mean, he then moved on from that, and he spelled out that America had no loyalty to Britain. After all, okay, we're of English descent, but what does that amount to? Nothing. Britain, being now an open enemy, extinguishes every other name and title of Britain. So he then moves on, and he said, and why is this? It's because America is always regarded as totally and utterly secondary as far as the Brits are concerned. And, that all that the connection with Britain has done is that it's actually led into wars with enemies who actually aren't really enemies. And this is where it's really interesting, because it ties in, having sort of put the boot into monarchy, he then does what Jefferson will do and says, well, of course, we don't want to alienate our great potential friends of France and Spain. He says that we can stand on our own. And basically, this is all quite extraordinary argument, and it's far further than people really were willing to go at the time.
It's an interesting thing that it took this apostate Englishman to come over and stake out what at that moment became a very extreme position, although the reaction to it was immediate and really fascinating. It's hard to track public opinion in those pre-digital days. Nobody was taking polls. But can you describe a bit the reaction to common sense?
Well, it was phenomenal. And the reason why it worked so well was because he, in politics, also in publishing, it really works when things coincide in your favor. And Paine actually explained this himself when his appendix to the third edition, which was a matter of weeks before the first edition. And he said, since the publication of this first edition of this pamphlet, or rather on the same day on which it came out, the king's speech made its appearance in this city. And what the King's speech was, it was so you couldn't make the argument anymore that it was all down to the ministry, because in the King's speech at the opening of Parliament, he was very much commander-in-chief. And he showed himself to be an aggressor, not a protector. He was talking about bringing in foreign mercenaries to put down the Americans in rebellion. It was sort of a stage further on. And Paine said, had the spirit of prophecy directed the birth of this production, i.e. common sense, it could not have brought it forth at a more seasonable juncture or at a more necessary time. And it's absolutely true.
Timing is everything.
Yeah, exactly. And so Paine had effectively given the answer to the speech when he didn't even know that the speech was going to come. I mean, it was extraordinary, and it was a totally fitting answer to it, and it was seen as such by all kinds of people. I mean, by George Washington, for instance, who actually he saw the speech. I mean, being obviously outside Boston, he saw it before Paine did, and the King had completely and utterly showed himself to be not the protector, as I said, but the aggressor. And Washington, in his sort of most sarcastic vein, said, "We are at length favoured with a sight of His Majesty's most gracious speech, breathing sentiments of tenderness and compassion for his deluded American subjects. The echo is not yet come to hand." But it did. It was in common sense. And so, I mean, that was part of the reason why it worked so well. It was the timing, but it was also the way that it was written. It was written for every man. And it was written incredibly well. I mean, its language is really, really effective. I mean, as much as I'm a great fan of Benjamin Franklin, having written a book of his time in London, some of Franklin's greatest pieces do go on a bit, but this is incredibly sharp. And as Benjamin Rush himself said, its effects were sudden and extensive upon the American mind. Not only was it read by public men, it was disseminated through clubs, schools, and pulpit. And in Philadelphia, it was a subject of conversation in coffee houses and taverns. And of course, the newspapers got hold of it, and it was helped even more by the fact you had opponents who came out and one pamphlet had a title of Nonsense, and Franklin's great enemy, Dr. William Smith, he attacked Paine under the pseudonym of Cato, which was rather pushing it a bit, because that was really the kind of Addison work of protest, against tyranny, against the rule of Julius Caesar. And of course, Julius Caesar would be used time and time again as this sort of the absolute archetypal tyrant. So, it worked incredibly well.
Now, I was struck by Paine, an atheist, using the Bible as one of his authorities for attacking the whole idea of monarchy. And he doesn't beat around the bush about it. He, as you say, just says kings are ridiculous. But how did he work it?
Well, I think it sort of it really did come from
the biblical element of that.
Yeah. I mean, it came from his background, of course, because even at one point, I mean, we talked about him being a Quaker and also being a Church of England. Those were his parents' religions. But he did actually preach as a Methodist at one point. So he certainly sort of He had the full set, if you like. And so he knew the Bible extremely well, and he used it because, let's face it, part of his audience in New England, would listen to a message using biblical language. And so it worked extremely well.
You are a connoisseur of skillful propaganda. How do you think Paine's effort holds up today?
Oh, well, I think it holds up incredibly well because it's it basically it ticked all the boxes that you would want to tick for a publication today. Basically, it was in all the newspapers, and he created a complete and utter controversy, and it really fitted the time. So that, that George Washington, for instance, he was very keen on common sense for one major reason, which was if we actually use the fact that he was extremely worried about how far the revolution was going to go, that it had to be, he and Virginian landowners were worried about radicalism. And there was a very good reason for this, that one of his overseers was basically starting a leveling, going back to the English Civil War, kind of leveling approach in Leesburg, saying that everybody should have the vote, and nobody should be rich, and all officers should be elected, and nobody should be paid. And there was a worry because there were all kinds of different potentially disturbing elements if you actually upset the status quo. Because not only were there the British forces, there were the Loyalists, there were people like the governor of Virginia wanting to liberate all the slaves and use them against the plantation owners. There were also
the royal governor.
Yeah, exactly. So the view was, I mean, it's a bit like the wonderful book on the Risorgimento in Sicily, that you had to actually go with the radicalism of the revolution because everything had to change if it was going to stay the same. The revolution had to be brought under control.
A measure of how Washington reacted to Paine is that although Paine was certainly no soldier,
yeah,
Washington brought him into the army.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you describe how Paine functioned within an army?
He acted as
a pilot.
Yeah, I mean, Nathaniel Greene brought him in the first place, and then he went over to Washington's staff, and he was an advisor, but he was also a propagandist. So that when things were extremely bleak with the sort of the collapse of the New York and New Jersey campaign, he was feeding pieces to the newspapers, basically turning every sort of flight after a battle of Washington and his troops was turned into the most glorious retreat. I mean, he wasn't, he had another great journalist who was Governor Livingston of New Jersey, and Livingston really pushed it even further. I mean, we completely and utterly reversed all the casualty figures, for instance. But they were forced, obviously, to cross the Delaware, but everything was in crisis. Everybody was. Washington himself was frightened that the middle colonies were going to give up and go over to the Brits, and so hence and of course Congress had fled to Baltimore, so everything was in chaos. And that's when Paine stepped up with his American Crisis articles. It's propaganda as poetry, and its first few lines. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sun patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the thanks of man and woman. And it is said, I don't know how apocryphal it is, that actually Washington had this read to his troops before they crossed the Delaware. And that, of course, was of incredible importance. Because it sort of rallied the cause.
Now, was there a similar response to this new American crisis within the army and within the population?
Well, I think, yes, I think it, well, I mean, common sense really was incredibly important, because what followed common sense was the Declaration of Independence. So in a way, it sort of cleared the ground for the Declaration of Independence, because it got people to think, oh, well, maybe things are very serious, but maybe we will have to give up the king. Maybe we'll have to go for independence. And of course, in some ways, the Declaration followed the same argument, except, of course, with one major difference. A major point, as well as bringing all the colonies together of the Declaration, was to make sure that France and Spain stayed on side. So there wasn't all this stuff about monarchy being terrible, terrible, terrible. It was much more on the basis of George III was the most absolutely tyrant, terrible man. All kinds of things were blamed on him, which was actually the absence of the truth, because George III had to, ruled through the king in parliament, i.e., he could only appoint prime ministers who had a majority in parliament. So he actually had to rule through parliament. But he was characterized as something completely different.
But I mean, you properly point out the role of France and Spain. The Americans knew they needed allies.
Of course.
They could not expect to defeat the British on their own.
No, of course. I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, when I turned up at Mount Vernon, I rather stunned them with a football analogy in my first talk, which was to say, very appropriate at the moment, of course, which was to say that Washington, it was like a football match where the Continental Army under Washington had to keep it going, had to keep the other side out and sort of maintain a sort of goalless draw, if you like, waiting for France to come on as a substitute in the second half and score the winning goal. And it was a bit like that. But I mean, it was an incredible role played by Washington. And Paine was actually useful. He continued to be useful as a propagandist. So, for instance, after Brandywine, he brought out American Crisis number 4, which basically said, okay, we are going to continue losing battles. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It was the old thing of we can lose time and time again. We only need to win once. And so he continued being incredibly important.
Now, what led Paine finally to leave the United States? He didn't stay that long after his first stay.
No, he didn't. Basically, he came up with a very bright idea to build a bridge, a sort of a bridge which was a full span, on each side, nothing needed, no great pillars in the middle. And he went to Britain. This was after the revolution in 87 to raise some money. Couldn't raise any money, so that didn't work. So he went to France. And what was wonderful, going on about all this stuff that he'd written about monarchy, when he arrived at Nantes, again in terrible, terrible condition, he was suffering then from scabies. and they greeted him like an absolute hero. Ignore all the stuff about down with monarchs and they're all terrible. And he was there, of course. He stayed on, and he stayed on throughout the French Revolution. And he was in the convention during the French Revolution, and he was imprisoned, and he almost got the chop, and he blamed Washington. He said Washington, as president, was deliberately keeping him there under Gouverneur Morris, who was the minister plenipotentiary. And that actually gave him, because Paine did have this brilliant ability to fall out with people. And so he then went on a kind of crusade against Washington, which was quite interesting.
Never a smart thing when you're dealing with Americans, but James Monroe did ultimately win his freedom.
Yeah, exactly. So, exactly. And I think...
And Paine ended up back in America, right?
Yeah, in 1802.
Yeah.
And again, he kept on being given lots of money, and he kept on losing it on bad investment. And so, I mean, he did find a somebody to look after him, but I mean, he was getting in sort of worse and worse condition. Mm-hmm. And he eventually died in 1809, which actually meant that he was 72, which was actually pretty good going, considering that he had sort of dissolved in drink, as it were. But even on his deathbed, he wasn't left alone, because actually, bizarrely, he did want to be buried in a Quaker's grave, but the Quakers said, "You must be joking," because you've written all this stuff. You've written your anti religious tracts. You've come out with your Age of Reason in 1793, which was a direct attack on religion. And there were all kinds of other Methodists and other nonconformists who kept on visiting him on his deathbed, trying to get him to sort of recant and pray for forgiveness from God. And he had to keep on getting them chucked out. But then he died in 1809. But even his bones were not allowed to rest in peace, because the great William Cobbett, who one of his great books was a tour through England called Rural Rides, which was a major book. He was a great journalist, and he was also a great admirer of Thomas Paine. So 10 years after Paine was buried, and because he couldn't be buried on sacred ground, he was actually buried on at his home, on the grounds of his home. Cobbett had him dug up, all the bones dug up, and then he lost most of them. And what they kept on going, bits kept on going missing in different places, but the bits that he had in the end, he actually took back to Thetford and had them buried there. So it was, for such a brilliant man, there were always these kind of sort of tragic elements. But we shouldn't allow those to cloud our vision of somebody who was incredibly important to American history.
Well, I'm very grateful that you made time to be part of this series. And I always learn something when I talk to you, George. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I've just loved it.
That was amazing. Just this deep dive into the founders and Thomas Paine. He is someone that not everyone knows. So now we get a little bit more insight. Thank you, George. You're incredibly articulate. We're thrilled to have you on the David O. Stewart Show, Season 1, The Democracy We Must Keep. So much to unpack around this book and this beautiful conversation. So thank you all. Thank you to our audience for listening. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, proud producer of the show on Incandescent Radio and Incandescent TV. And you can find us on Spotify, iHeart, and Apple Podcasts. We'll talk to you soon.